The carriage door slammed shut before Alara could put her foot on the step, and the wheels began to turn against the frozen street. She ran 2 steps after it, her thin silk shoes sliding on the ice, and called out her stepmother's name. The carriage did not slow. Through the small window she saw Beatrice's face, pale and smiling, pressed close to the glass, watching her the way a child watches a bird fall from its nest. Then the carriage turned the corner and was gone, and Alara stood alone on the wide stone steps of Ashbourne House with the wind cutting through her thin blue gown. She wrapped her arms around herself and looked up at the enormous house glowing with candlelight. Every window burned gold. Laughter and violin music spilled out into the night, and carriages kept arriving behind her, one after another, each one letting down warm, well-dressed guests who did not look at her twice. She stepped back into the shadow of a stone pillar so no one would see her face. This had not been an accident. She understood that clearly now. Her stepmother, Lady Constance Whitfield, had planned every part of this evening with the same care she gave to planning a dinner party. Alara had been dressed and brought along only to be left behind at the last possible moment, in front of the grandest house in the city, where the shame would be sharpest and most public. She thought of the carriage ride, of Constance's calm voice telling her to fetch a shawl from the second coach, of the second coach mysteriously not being there when she returned, of Beatrice's soft laugh as the family carriage pulled away without her. It had all happened so quickly. There had been no argument, no scene, nothing anyone passing by could point to and call cruel. Just a young woman standing outside a ball, apparently forgotten. Alara pressed her back against the cold stone and tried to think clearly. She could not knock on the door of a duke's house and ask to be let in. She had no invitation of her own. Her name had never been written on the guest list, only added to her stepmother's card as an afterthought, the way one might add a spare umbrella to a list of things to pack. She could not walk home alone at this hour, not in a ball gown, not through streets she barely knew. She could not stand here all night either, not in this cold, with her hands already losing their feeling. Footsteps approached from the direction of the entrance, unhurried, deliberate. She turned her face away, hoping to be mistaken for a servant waiting on an errand, but the footsteps did not pass her by. They stopped a few feet away, and a low voice spoke into the darkness. "You are standing outside my house in the cold, and you are dressed for my ballroom. I find that an interesting combination." Alara turned. The man before her was tall, dressed in black and gray, his dark hair swept back from a face that held no warmth and no cruelty either, only a kind of careful stillness, as though he had trained himself long ago never to show what he was thinking. She did not need an introduction to know who stood before her. Everyone in the city knew the Duke of Ashbourne by sight, if not by friendship, for he had few friends and fewer admirers who dared say so to his face. He was spoken of in careful whispers, a man whose temper was said to be as cold as winter water, whose disapproval had ended more than one young man's place in society. He had never, in 5 years of hosting this very ball, opened it with a dance. "Your Grace." She dropped into a stiff curtsy, her frozen hands shaking slightly as she gathered her skirts. "I am sorry to be found here. I was only waiting for my family's carriage to return." "Waiting," he repeated, as though testing the word for truth and finding it wanting. His eyes moved over her without any warmth, cataloging details the way a man might read a letter, quickly and without sentiment. Her lips had gone pale from cold. Her arms were bare and covered in small bumps beneath the thin fabric of her sleeves. There was no shawl, no maid standing nearby, no sign of any carriage waiting anywhere on the street. "Your family left without you." It was not a question, and Alara found she had no answer that would not sound either foolish or humiliating, so she said nothing at all. The silence seemed to tell him everything he needed to know. "What is your name?" "Alara Whitfield, Your Grace." Something shifted very slightly in his expression. A flicker of recognition quickly smoothed away. He knew the Whitfield name, of course. Everyone in this part of the city knew it. A family of modest fortune and considerable ambition, recently much occupied with securing a good match for the younger daughter. He had heard nothing of an elder daughter, and looking at the young woman shivering in front of him now, he began to understand why. A family building a case for one daughter's brilliant future had little use for a stepdaughter standing quietly in the background, reminding guests that the family's fortune had come, in part, from a first wife long since buried. "Come inside," he said. Alara blinked. "Your Grace, I could not possibly. I was not invited in my own name, and I am not fit to be seen. My gown is creased from the carriage, and I have no shawl, and my hair—" "Miss Whitfield," his voice cut through her protest without rising in volume at all, which somehow made it more effective than shouting would have been. "You are standing on my property, in weather that could make you seriously ill, having been abandoned by people who ought to have protected you. I am not in the habit of leaving guests, invited or otherwise, to freeze on my steps. Come inside." He extended his arm. Alara stared at it for a long moment, her mind racing through every possible outcome of accepting it, every rumor that might spread if she were seen entering the ball on the Duke of Ashbourne's arm rather than through the ordinary crush of the front doors with everyone else. But the alternative was standing here until her fingers went numb entirely, waiting for a carriage that would not return until well past midnight, if it returned for her at all. She took his arm. His sleeve was warm even through the cold night air, and she felt, for the first time in what felt like hours, that she might not freeze after all. He led her not around to some servant's entrance, as she half expected, but directly up the front steps and through the great doors, past 2 footmen who did not so much as blink at the sight of their master arriving with an unfamiliar young woman on his arm. Alara understood, in that moment, that this household was accustomed to obeying without question, and that whatever the Duke chose to do, however unusual, would simply be accepted as the way things were. The ballroom opened before them in a wash of light and color and sound. Hundreds of candles burned in great chandeliers overhead, and the air smelled of beeswax and hothouse flowers and expensive perfume. Musicians tuned their instruments on a raised platform at the far end of the room, and guests in silk and jewels moved in clusters, exchanging bows and gossip in equal measure. Alara felt every inch of her creased gown and wind-blown hair as though it had been announced aloud. Then the music began, the first notes of the opening dance, and every head in the room turned toward the entrance out of habit, expecting to see their host arrive alone, as he had every year before this one. Instead, they saw Duke Alaric Ashbourne leading a young woman none of them recognized directly onto the dance floor. The room went very quiet, quiet enough that Alara could hear her own heartbeat over the last fading notes of the tuning instruments. She felt hundreds of eyes settle on her at once, felt the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions pressing against her skin. Who is she? Where did he find her? Why has he never done this before? "Your Grace," she whispered as he turned to face her and offered his hand for the dance. "Everyone is staring." "They are," he agreed, entirely unbothered. "They will stare regardless of what either of us does now, so we may as well give them something worth the trouble." Somewhere near the edge of the room, she caught sight of a face she recognized, and her stomach turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Lord Percival Hale stood near a pillar with a glass of wine in his hand, his eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not quite read, something between surprise and calculation. He was a frequent visitor to her family's house, a man her stepmother spoke of with unusual warmth whenever the subject of Alara's future came up, though Alara herself had never been asked what she thought of him. Now he watched her take the Duke's hand, as though rearranging figures on a chessboard behind his eyes. The music swelled, and Alara had no more time to think of Percival Hale or her stepmother or the cold street outside, because the Duke's hand had closed around hers and the dance had begun. She had learned to dance as a girl, before her father's second marriage, before the household had reorganized itself around Constance's preferences and Beatrice's future. The steps came back to her slowly at first, then more surely as the music carried her along, and she found that dancing with the Duke of Ashbourne required very little of her beyond following his lead, which he gave clearly and without impatience, adjusting his pace when she faltered without ever making her feel the fault of it. "You dance as though you have not done so in some time," he observed quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone beneath the sound of the orchestra. "I have not had many occasions, Your Grace. And yet you dance well. That is unusual. Most people who have not practiced in years dance badly, whether they once knew how or not." Alara did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and he did not press her further, which she found she appreciated more than she expected to. They turned together beneath the chandeliers, and for a few strange suspended minutes, she forgot the cold street outside, and the carriage that had left without her, and the whispers already beginning to move through the crowd like wind through tall grass. When the dance ended, he did not release her hand immediately. Instead, he looked at her with the same careful, assessing expression he had worn on the front steps, as though he were still deciding something about her that he had not yet fully resolved. "You will need somewhere to sit," he said, "and something to eat. You look as though you have not had a proper meal today." She had not, in fact, though she had not expected anyone to notice. "I would not want to trouble Your Grace any further. You have already been more than generous." "It is no trouble." He led her toward a quieter corner of the room, near tall windows overlooking the dark garden, where a servant appeared almost instantly with a plate of small sandwiches and a glass of warmed wine, as though the Duke's staff had learned to anticipate his wishes before he spoke them aloud. "Eat. Then we will discuss how you came to be standing outside my house without a carriage." Ilara accepted the plate with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Across the room, she could feel Percival Hale's gaze still following her, and beyond him, near the entrance, she saw two women she recognized instantly, their heads bent close together in urgent conversation. Lady Constance had returned. Beside her stood Beatrice, no longer smiling the small, satisfied smile she had worn from the carriage window, but staring across the crowded ballroom at her stepsister with an expression of open, undisguised shock. Ilara met her stepmother's eyes across the room, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not look away first. The evening, she understood, had only just begun, and whatever came next would not be so easily controlled as a carriage pulling away in the dark. Lady Constance did not approach at once. She stood near the entrance with Beatrice at her side, watching the crowd close in around Ilara and the Duke with the patience of a woman who had learned long ago that a well-timed silence could do more damage than any accusation. Ilara finished the small plate of sandwiches the Duke had given her, though she barely tasted them, too aware of the eyes still drifting toward her from every corner of the ballroom. "Your family has arrived," the Duke said, following her gaze without turning his head too obviously. "The woman by the door, that is your stepmother." "Yes, Your Grace. She does not look pleased to see you here." "No," Ilara admitted. "I would imagine she is not." He studied her face for a moment, as though weighing how much more to ask, then seemed to decide against pressing further in so public a setting. "Come, walk with me. If they wish to speak with you, they may do so where I can hear it." It was not a request so much as an arrangement already decided, and Ilara found she did not mind. She let him lead her through the crowd, nodding politely to guests who bowed and curtsied to the Duke as he passed, their curious eyes sliding to Ilara and then away again, unwilling to be caught staring too openly. By the time they reached the entrance, Lady Constance had composed her face into an expression of warm concern, so convincing that Ilara nearly admired the skill of it. "Ilara, my dear. There you are." Constance reached out and took both of Ilara's hands as though greeting a long-lost daughter rather than a girl she had abandoned an hour earlier. We were beside ourselves with worry. The coachman misunderstood which entrance to wait at, and by the time we realized you were not with us, we had already circled the block twice looking for you. It was a smooth lie, delivered without hesitation, and Ilara understood at once that it was meant less for her than for the Duke standing beside her, and for anyone else within hearing distance. She opened her mouth to respond, uncertain even now whether to contradict the story outright or simply let it stand, when the Duke spoke first. "How fortunate that I happened to find her before the cold did any real harm," he said, his tone perfectly even, giving away nothing of what he might privately think of the coachman's convenient confusion. "She was standing on my front steps for some time, Lady Whitfield. Long enough that her hands had gone quite numb when I discovered her." Constance's smile did not waver, though something behind her eyes went very still. "How dreadful. I shall speak to the coachman most severely." "Please do." The Duke's voice remained pleasant, almost conversational, and yet Ilara felt the faint undercurrent running beneath it, a warning delivered so smoothly that only someone listening closely would recognize it as one at all. It would trouble me greatly to learn that a young woman under my roof for the evening had come to any harm through simple carelessness. Beatrice, standing slightly behind her mother, had said nothing throughout the exchange, but Ilara caught the quick, sideways glance she gave the Duke, assessing him the way she might assess a piece of jewelry in a shop window, wondering what it might be worth and how it might be acquired. It was Beatrice, after all, who had been dressed and prepared for this very ball with the specific hope of catching the interest of exactly this man. And instead it was her overlooked, forgotten stepsister standing at his side. "You are too kind, Your Grace," Constance said, recovering her composure with practiced ease. "We shall take Ilara home directly, so she may rest after such a fright." "There is no need," the Duke replied. "The evening is still young, and Miss Whitfield has only just arrived. I see no reason to send her home before she has had a proper chance to enjoy herself." Ilara watched her stepmother's expression flicker, just for an instant, caught between the desire to argue and the certainty that arguing with the Duke of Ashbourne in the middle of his own ballroom would draw exactly the kind of attention the family least wished for. Constance chose in the end to smile again, though it did not reach her eyes. "Of course, whatever you think best, Your Grace. Ilara, do enjoy the evening. We will find you when it is time to leave." They withdrew into the crowd, and Ilara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Beside her, the Duke watched the two women disappear among the other guests with an expression she could not quite read. "Your stepmother is a skilled liar," he observed quietly, once they were out of earshot. She has had a great deal of practice. And your stepsister says very little, for someone so clearly interested in what happens to you. Ilara glanced up at him, surprised he had noticed something she had spent years learning to read for herself. Beatrice watches more than she speaks. It has always been that way, since our father remarried. Your father is not present tonight. He rarely leaves the country house anymore. His health has not been strong these past 2 years, and Constance manages most household matters in his absence. She did not add what she truly thought, that her father's poor health had conveniently coincided with Constance gaining nearly total control over the family's decisions, including which daughter received new gowns and invitations, and which was left to wear last season's cast-offs and stand outside in the cold. The Duke said nothing further on the subject, though Ilara had the distinct impression that he had understood far more than she had actually told him. They walked together toward the edge of the ballroom, and as the evening wore on, she found herself drawn into conversation with other guests, mostly out of curiosity about who she was and how she had come to arrive on the Duke's arm, though a few seemed genuinely interested in her once they discovered she had a quick wit and a willingness to speak plainly, a rarity among the carefully polished young women who usually filled these rooms. Lord Percival Hale found his way to her side sometime near midnight, when the crowd had thinned slightly and the musicians had begun a slower set of dances. He bowed with practiced grace and asked if she would honor him with the next dance, and Ilara, unable to think of a polite reason to refuse without drawing further attention, accepted. "You look well tonight," he said as they took their places among the other couples. "Better than well, in fact. I had not realized you owned such a fine gown." "It is the same gown I have worn to the last 3 occasions I attended, Lord Hale." "Is it? I must simply not have looked closely enough before." His eyes moved over her with an assessing quality that reminded her uncomfortably of the way Beatrice had looked at the Duke earlier, as though calculating value. "You have caused quite a stir tonight, Miss Whitfield." The Duke of Ashbourne does not often take notice of young women at his own balls, let alone lead them in the opening dance. It was a matter of circumstance, nothing more. "Perhaps," he smiled, though the smile did not entirely reach his eyes. "Circumstance has a way of proving useful, in my experience. Your family has spoken to me at some length about your prospects, Miss Whitfield. I confess I had not fully appreciated them until this evening." Ilara felt a small, cold knot form in her stomach. "My prospects, Lord Hale? Your inheritance from your mother's family, to be precise. I understand it is held in trust until your marriage, at which point it becomes rather substantial." He said this lightly, as though remarking on the weather, but Ilara understood immediately what he was truly telling her, and why her stepmother had spoken so warmly of him at every family dinner for the past several months. "Your stepmother has been kind enough to discuss the matter with me directly. I had hoped we might come to an understanding before the season progresses much further. I was not aware any understanding had been reached," Ilara said carefully, keeping her voice level despite the anger rising in her chest. "Not yet, of course. These matters take time to arrange properly." He guided her through the next turn of the dance without missing a step, his tone remaining pleasant even as the words beneath it grew sharper. "But I would advise you not to let tonight's small excitement give you ideas above your situation, Miss Whitfield. A duke does not marry a girl with no dowry to speak of and a family eager to be rid of her. I, on the other hand, am prepared to offer you a very comfortable life, once matters are properly settled." Ilara said nothing for several long moments, her mind working quickly beneath her calm exterior. She had suspected, in some vague and unformed way, that her stepmother's sudden warmth toward Lord Hale in recent months had something to do with money, but she had not realized the full shape of the arrangement until this moment, standing in the middle of a crowded ballroom being informed, quite calmly, that her own inheritance had already been discussed, and half decided without her knowledge or consent. "I was not aware," she said finally, "that my hand was Lady Whitfield's to promise. Your father has not been well enough to manage such affairs directly. Someone must see to your future in his place." Percival's smile remained fixed and pleasant, entirely untroubled by the coldness in her voice. "I only mean to be honest with you, Miss Whitfield, so there is no confusion later. Whatever attention you receive tonight from certain quarters will not last. It never does. Men like the Duke amuse themselves with novelty and then move on to more suitable matches. I, however, intend to remain a steady and reliable choice for you." The dance ended before Ilara could form a response sharp enough to satisfy her, and Percival bowed over her hand with exaggerated courtesy before withdrawing into the crowd, leaving her standing alone with her thoughts spinning and her jaw tight with barely restrained anger. She had known, in a distant sort of way, that her family considered her a burden to be managed rather than a daughter to be cared for, but hearing it stated so plainly, wrapped in the polite language of a marriage proposal, struck her harder than she had expected. "You look as though someone has just insulted you," a familiar voice said from beside her, and she turned to find the Duke had appeared at her elbow, his sharp eyes moving over her face with the same careful attention he had shown on the front steps hours earlier. "I am simply tired, Your Grace. It has been a long evening." "It has," he agreed, though his tone suggested he did not entirely believe her explanation. Lord Hale did not appear to be offering comfort, from what I observed of the dance. Alara hesitated, uncertain how much to say to a man she had known for only a handful of hours, however unusual and generous those hours had been. But something in his steady, patient gaze made her think that perhaps, for once, honesty might not be the mistake it usually was. "He informed me that my family has been discussing an arrangement between us, one I was not consulted about." The Duke's expression did not change dramatically, but something in his eyes sharpened, the careful stillness she had noticed earlier taking on a harder edge. "An arrangement regarding marriage, I take it." "Regarding my inheritance, more precisely. My marriage would simply be the mechanism by which it changes hands." "I see." He was quiet for a moment, watching Percival Hale's retreating figure across the room with an expression Alara could not fully read, something between contempt and calculation. "And your stepmother arranged this without your knowledge?" "My stepmother arranges a great many things without my knowledge, Your Grace. Tonight was simply the first time I have been permitted to witness one of them so directly." He turned back to face her fully, and for a moment, the noise and light of the ballroom seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the quiet weight of his attention. "You should not have to marry a man chosen for you by a family that leaves you standing in the cold, Miss Whitfield." "I am not certain I have much say in the matter, Your Grace. My father's health leaves the household decisions to Lady Whitfield, and Lady Whitfield has made her preferences quite clear." He did not answer immediately, and when he finally spoke, his voice had taken on a tone she had not heard from him before, quieter, more deliberate, as though he were choosing each word with unusual care. "There may be more say in the matter than you currently believe. But that is a conversation for another time, not for the middle of a crowded ballroom at midnight." Before Alara could ask what he meant, a servant approached and murmured something briefly into the Duke's ear, and his expression shifted into the polished neutrality he seemed to wear for the benefit of his guests. "You will excuse me a moment. A small matter requires my attention." He paused, studying her face once more. "Do not leave with your family tonight, Miss Whitfield. I will arrange for you to stay under proper care until we have had time to speak more fully about your situation." He withdrew before she could protest, leaving Alara standing near the tall windows with her heart beating strangely fast, and Percival Hale's warning still echoing uncomfortably in her ears, alongside a new and unfamiliar feeling she could not quite name, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Mrs. Agnes Doyle had managed the Ashbourne household for 11 years, long enough to have seen the young Duke grow into the guarded, watchful man he was now, and long enough to know that when he asked her to prepare a guest room without further explanation, it was best not to ask too many questions until he was ready to offer answers on his own. Still, when he found her in the corridor outside the ballroom shortly after midnight and told her that a Miss Whitfield would be staying at Ashbourne House for the remainder of the evening, and likely longer, she allowed herself one raised eyebrow before nodding and setting off to prepare the blue guest room at once. "She has nothing with her," the Duke added. "No trunk, no maid. See that she has whatever she requires." "Of course, Your Grace." Agnes studied his face for a moment longer than strictly necessary, the way she had studied him since he was a boy, learning to hide his feelings behind a still expression, and something in what she saw there made her decide to ask no further questions that night. "I will see to it personally." By the time the last guests had departed and the great house had settled into the quiet hush that followed every ball, Alara found herself seated in a warm, comfortable room on the second floor, wrapped in a borrowed dressing gown while Agnes fussed over a tray of tea and biscuits with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had spent a lifetime caring for people who rarely thought to thank her properly. "You'll forgive me for saying so, miss, but you look as though you have not had a proper meal in some days," Agnes said, setting the tray down with a decisive clink. "There's more good food in this house than we know what to do with, and it does my heart no good to see a young lady go without." "I have not gone hungry, Mrs. Doyle," Alara said, though the words came out less certain than she intended. In truth, meals at the Whitfield house had grown smaller and more infrequent for her over the past year, as Constance redirected household spending toward Beatrice's wardrobe and social engagements, leaving Alara's portion, quite literally, as an afterthought. Agnes said nothing to contradict her, but the look she gave Alara suggested she understood the truth of the matter regardless of what was said aloud. "Well, You'll eat well while you're under this roof, whatever the arrangement turns out to be. His Grace does not do things by half measures, once he has decided to do them at all. Has he done something like this before? Taken in a stranger for the night? Never, miss. Not once in the 11 years I have served this household. Agnes poured the tea with careful precision, her expression thoughtful. He is not an unkind man, whatever the papers and the gossips say of him, but he is a careful one, and careful men do not act on impulse the way he acted tonight, bringing you in from the cold and leading you out for the first dance in front of the whole of society. Something about you must have struck him, miss, though I could not tell you what. Alara did not know how to answer that, so she simply accepted the cup of tea and let its warmth spread through her cold hands, grateful for the first true kindness she had been shown in longer than she cared to admit. She slept that night in the blue guest room beneath a mountain of soft blankets, and for the first time in months, she did not wake in the small hours of the morning listening for the sound of Constance's footsteps in the hall, wondering what new humiliation the coming day might bring. The Duke found her the next morning in the small breakfast room overlooking the garden, where Agnes had settled her with instructions to eat as much as she liked. He entered without ceremony, dressed more plainly than she had seen him the night before, and took the seat across from her without waiting to be invited. You slept well, I hope. Better than I have in some time, Your Grace. Thank you for your hospitality. I do not know how I will repay such kindness. You need not think in terms of repayment, he said, waving away the suggestion with mild impatience. I did not offer you shelter as a transaction, Miss Whitfield. I offered it because I found the situation troubling and saw a simple way to address it. He accepted a cup of coffee from a passing servant and studied her over the rim of it, his sharp eyes moving over her face with the same careful attention she had noticed the night before. I have been thinking about what you told me, about Lord Hale, and the arrangement your stepmother has been discussing on your behalf. Alara set down her fork, her appetite suddenly forgotten. I would rather not think of it at all, if I am honest, Your Grace. It was not a pleasant thing to hear. No, I imagine it was not. He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly on its saucer. Tell me about your father. You mentioned he has not been well. He suffered a serious illness 2 years ago, an affliction of the heart that left him weak and easily tired. He rarely leaves his bed at the country house now, and Constance has managed all matters concerning the household and the family's finances since then. Alara chose her words carefully, aware even now of a lifelong habit of protecting her family's reputation, however little they had done to earn her loyalty. He is a kind man, Your Grace, or was, before his illness took so much of his strength. I do not believe he knows the full extent of what Constance has done in his absence. And your inheritance, tell me more of that. She hesitated, uncertain why he wished to know such details, though something in his steady, patient manner made her feel that his interest was not idle curiosity, but something more purposeful. My mother's family left a sum in trust for me when she died, to be paid out upon my marriage or my 25th birthday, whichever comes first. I am 22 now. Constance has always spoken of it as though it were her own to distribute, though legally it belongs to me alone. How much is the sum? Alara told him, and something in his expression sharpened, though he said nothing immediately, simply turning the information over in his mind with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. That is a considerable amount, Miss Whitfield. More than considerable for a family in your stepmother's position, particularly one attempting to fund a second daughter's introduction to society on a limited income. You believe that is why Constance wishes to see me married to Lord Hale so quickly. I believe your stepmother has debts, Miss Whitfield, or expenses that have outpaced her means, and I believe your inheritance represents a solution to that problem, provided she can arrange your marriage to a man willing to share the proceeds with her in exchange for his silence and cooperation. He said this plainly, without softening it for her benefit, and Alara found she appreciated the honesty, even as it confirmed her worst suspicions about the family she had grown up believing, however imperfectly, cared for her welfare. Lord Hale did not strike me as a man motivated by affection last night, if I am honest in my assessment. He was not, Your Grace. He spoke of my inheritance more plainly than he spoke of anything resembling regard for my character. The Duke set down his cup, his expression settling into something colder and more determined than she had yet seen from him. Then we shall have to ensure he does not receive the opportunity to act on that plain speaking, Miss Whitfield. I have no intention of allowing a man of Lord Hale's evident character to secure your fortune through a marriage arranged without your true consent, particularly not while you remain under my protection. You are very generous, Your Grace, but I do not wish to become a burden or an obligation to you. You owe me nothing, and I have no claim on your continued assistance beyond one evening's kindness. I did not offer my assistance because I felt obligated, Miss Whitfield. I offered it because I chose to, and I intend to continue choosing to, for as long as it takes to see you safely out from under your stepmother's influence." He paused, and for the first time since she had met him, something almost like uncertainty crossed his features, quickly suppressed but not entirely hidden. "I do not extend such offers lightly, or often. I would ask that you not mistake my reasons for pity. Pity was not what I felt, watching you stand outside my house last night." Elara did not know how to respond to that, and the silence that followed felt weighted with something neither of them seemed ready to name directly. She was saved from finding an answer by the sound of Agnes clearing her throat in the doorway, holding a folded letter with an expression of mild concern. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but a message has arrived for Miss Whitfield. The messenger said it was urgent and asked that it be delivered directly." Elara accepted the letter with a growing sense of unease, recognizing her stepmother's precise, elegant handwriting on the outer fold. She broke the seal and read quickly, her stomach tightening with each line. "My dear Elara," the letter began, in a tone of exaggerated warmth that fooled no one who knew Constance well. "I trust you slept comfortably under His Grace's roof, though I confess your continued absence from our household has caused a great deal of concern among our acquaintances, who naturally wonder at the circumstances. I must insist you return home at once, so that we may discuss your future properly, as a family. Lord Hale has been most understanding of the confusion surrounding last night's events, and remains eager to proceed with the arrangements we have discussed. I trust you will not do anything foolish that might further damage the family's reputation, particularly given how much we have all sacrificed on your behalf over these past years. Your loving stepmother, Constance." Elara read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly with a mixture of anger and dread, before setting it down on the table and pushing it toward the Duke, who had watched her expression darken through each line without interrupting. He read it in silence, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly by the time he reached the end. "Your stepmother is quite skilled at wrapping threats in the language of concern. She has had years of practice, Your Grace. This is precisely how she has always operated, layering pleasant words over unpleasant demands, so that anyone reading them without full context would see nothing but a worried mother wishing her daughter well. And what does she truly wish, do you think? For me to return home quietly, marry Lord Hale before any further scandal attaches itself to the family name, and hand over my inheritance without further complication." Elara folded her hands in her lap, forcing herself to remain calm despite the fear churning beneath her composed exterior. "She will not simply let this matter rest, Your Grace. She has invested too much in Lord Hale's arrangement to abandon it now, and my presence here, however innocent, gives her every reason to claim I have brought further shame upon the family, shame she will use to pressure me into compliance." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter with an expression she could not fully decipher, something between calculation and quiet fury, carefully restrained. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new firmness that left no room for argument. "You will not be returning to your stepmother's house today, Miss Whitfield, nor tomorrow, nor at any point until this matter has been resolved properly and in your favor. I will send word that you remain under my care, recovering from the shock of last night's abandonment, which happens to be entirely true regardless of how your stepmother chooses to characterize it. In the meantime, I intend to look into Lord Hale's financial circumstances more closely, and your stepmother's as well. If there are debts driving this arrangement, I would very much like to know their full extent before I decide how best to address them. You would go to such trouble for me, Your Grace? We have known each other scarcely a day. A day is sometimes all it takes to see clearly what matters, Miss Whitfield." He rose from the table, his expression settling back into the careful, controlled stillness she had first encountered on his front steps, though something warmer flickered briefly beneath it before he turned to leave the room. "Rest today. Agnes will see that you have everything you require, including proper clothing, since it seems your family did not think to send along even a change of gown. Tomorrow, we begin sorting out precisely what your stepmother and Lord Hale have been planning, and precisely how we intend to stop them." He left her alone with the letter still resting on the table between them, its careful, poisonous phrases seeming to grow louder in the silence of the room, and Elara found herself staring after him with a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest, the first true sense in longer than she could remember that someone, finally, stood ready to fight on her side, rather than against her. Over the following days, Ashbourne House settled into a quiet rhythm Elara had almost forgotten was possible. She woke each morning to sunlight, rather than the sound of Constance's sharp voice ordering the household about, ate proper meals at proper hours, and found herself, for the first time in years, with nothing pressing to fear or plan against. It should have felt strange, this sudden abundance of peace, and in some ways it did, but mostly it felt like breathing after holding her breath for a very long time without realizing it. Agnes had taken it upon herself to see that Alara wanted for nothing, arranging for a modest but tasteful wardrobe to be delivered from a seamstress the Duke trusted, and fussing over Alara's meals with the particular attention of a woman who had, Alara suspected, wanted daughters of her own, and never had them. In the evenings, when the Duke's business allowed, he and Alara would sit together in the small library on the ground floor, and what began as careful, formal conversation slowly loosened into something easier, something that felt, to Alara's growing surprise, almost like friendship. "You read a great deal," she observed one evening, watching him turn the pages of a heavy book on estate law with the focused attention he seemed to give everything. "I find it preferable to most company," he admitted, not looking up. "Books do not lie to serve their own interests, generally speaking." "That is a rather bleak way to view the people around you, Your Grace." He set the book down then, studying her with an expression that had grown more familiar to her over the past several days, less guarded than the cold stillness he wore for society, though still careful in its own way. "You would think so, perhaps, if you had not spent the past 3 days learning firsthand what your own family is capable of." Alara had no answer for that, because he was not wrong, and the silence between them stretched comfortably rather than awkwardly, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the soft rustle of pages. It was during moments like these, quiet and undemanding, that Alara found herself learning small pieces of the man beneath the Duke's cold reputation, fragments he offered carefully, as though testing whether she could be trusted with them. "My mother died when I was 12, he told her one such evening, apropos of nothing, staring into the fire rather than at her. "My father remarried within the year, to a woman who made it very clear that my presence in the household was an inconvenience she tolerated, only because the law required it. I learned early that showing weakness in that house invited only further cruelty, so I stopped showing it entirely." "Is that why society believes you cold, Your Grace?" "Society believes what is convenient for society to believe. I have never troubled myself to correct the impression, since it serves a useful purpose. Men who believe me difficult rarely trouble me with unwanted requests, and women who believe me heartless rarely trouble me with unwanted attention." A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. "Until recently, at least." Alara felt her cheeks warm at the implication behind his words, though she was not entirely certain what to make of it, and chose to say nothing rather than risk misreading his meaning. He did not press the matter further that evening, but she noticed, in the days that followed, that his careful reserve around her continued to soften in small, almost imperceptible ways. A lingering glance held a moment longer than necessary, a hand offered to guide her through a doorway that she did not strictly need help navigating, a genuine warmth in his rare smiles that she suspected few people outside this household had ever been permitted to see. Not everyone observing this quiet unfolding shared Alara's growing contentment. Beatrice had written twice since the ball, each letter shorter and colder than the last, ostensibly checking on her stepsister's welfare while making increasingly pointed remarks about how unusual it was for a young lady to remain so long under a bachelor's roof without proper chaperonage, and how such an arrangement, however innocent, might raise questions among their acquaintances that would be difficult to answer satisfactorily. Alara understood the letters for what they were, not genuine concern, but careful preparation for whatever scheme Constance intended to deploy next. She found Beatrice's third letter waiting for her on a morning nearly a week after the ball, and this one carried a different tone entirely, one that made the careful peace she had built at Ashbourne House feel suddenly, dangerously fragile. "Alara," the letter read, "Mother has spoken with Lord Hale at length, and he has grown impatient with the delay in settling matters between you. He has suggested, and Mother agrees, that a formal announcement of your engagement would put an end to any lingering gossip about your extended stay with the Duke, and would demonstrate to society that your family's honor remains intact despite recent events. Mother intends to call upon His Grace herself this week to discuss the matter directly. I thought you should know before she arrives, so that you are not taken by surprise. Beatrice." Alara read the letter with a growing sense of dread, understanding immediately what her stepmother intended. If Constance arrived at Ashbourne House and made a public appeal, framing the engagement as a matter of restoring the family's damaged honor, it would place the Duke in a difficult position, forced either to appear complicit in Alara's continued presence under his roof without proper explanation, or to hand her back into her stepmother's control to preserve appearances. She found the Duke in his study and showed him the letter without preamble, watching his expression darken as he read it. "Your stepmother intends to force my hand by appealing to propriety," he said, once he had finished reading. She calculates, correctly, that society cares a great deal about appearances and very little about the truth behind them. What will you do, Your Grace? He was quiet for a long moment, his sharp eyes fixed on some point in the distance, working through the problem with the same methodical care he seemed to bring to every difficult matter. I have been making certain inquiries this past week, Miss Whitfield, into your stepmother's finances and Lord Hale's as well. What I have learned may prove useful, though I had hoped to gather more before acting on it. What have you learned? Lord Hale owes a considerable sum to several creditors in the city, debts he has been quietly avoiding through a series of loans taken against his family's remaining property. He requires your inheritance urgently, not merely as a convenient windfall, but as a necessity to avoid a public reckoning with his creditors that would ruin what remains of his standing. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. Your stepmother, meanwhile, has borrowed against your father's estate to fund Beatrice's introduction to society. Borrowed more than the estate can reasonably support, particularly given your father's uncertain health. Your inheritance, once secured through your marriage to Hale, would resolve both of their difficulties simultaneously, with a portion presumably promised to your stepmother in exchange for arranging the match. Elara absorbed this information slowly, feeling the full weight of it settle over her like a physical thing. She had known, in a vague and unformed way, that her family's finances had grown strained in recent years, but she had never imagined the situation had grown quite so desperate, nor that her own inheritance had become so central to resolving it. They mean to use me to save themselves from ruin, and to do it in a way that appears, to anyone watching from outside, like nothing more than a reasonable family arranging a reasonable marriage. Precisely. The Duke's expression had settled into the cold, controlled fury she had glimpsed only once before, on the morning he read Constance's first letter. But knowing the truth of a scheme is not the same as having the means to stop it publicly, Miss Whitfield, particularly when your stepmother is prepared to frame any resistance as evidence of impropriety on your part or on mine. Then what can we do? He turned to face her fully, and something in his expression shifted, the careful calculation giving way to something more direct, more personal. I have been considering a course of action these past several days, one I had not intended to raise so soon, given how briefly we have known one another. But your stepmother's letter forces the matter sooner than I would have chosen. Elara's heart began to beat faster, though she could not yet name why. What course of action, Your Grace? If your stepmother intends to force an engagement to save appearances, then perhaps the solution is not to resist the idea of an engagement entirely, but to ensure it is the correct engagement, one that serves your genuine interests rather than theirs. He held her gaze steadily, his voice quieter now, more careful than she had ever heard it. I would ask you to consider, Miss Whitfield, whether you might be willing to entertain an offer of marriage from me, not as a matter of rescue or convenience, but as a genuine proposal, made with full understanding of who you are and what you have endured. Elara stood very still, the study around her seeming to fall away entirely, leaving only the sound of her own racing heart and the weight of his steady, earnest gaze. Whatever answer she had expected to find waiting for her when she left Ashbourne House that morning, it had not been this. You barely know me, Your Grace, she managed finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I know enough, he said simply. I know that you have survived years of quiet cruelty without losing your dignity or your kindness. I know that you dance as though you have not forgotten how to hope, even after everything your family has done to convince you that hope is foolish. I know that in the week since I found you standing outside my own house in the cold, I have looked forward to our evenings together, more than I have looked forward to anything and longer than I care to admit. He paused, something almost vulnerable crossing his carefully guarded features. I am not asking you to decide this moment, Miss Whitfield. I am only asking you to consider it, before your stepmother arrives and attempts to force a different answer entirely. Elara did not answer him that day, though the question lingered in the quiet spaces between them for the rest of the afternoon, a fragile, unexpected possibility taking root somewhere beneath her careful composure, even as the looming threat of her stepmother's visit pressed closer with each passing hour. Lady Constance Whitfield arrived at Ashbourne House 2 days later, precisely as Beatrice's letter had warned, dressed in her finest morning gown and wearing an expression of composed, righteous concern that had clearly been practiced before a mirror until it looked entirely natural. She was shown into the drawing room by a footman who betrayed nothing of the household's private assessment of her character, and there she found not only the Duke waiting to receive her, but Elara as well, seated calmly beside him with her hands folded in her lap and her expression carefully neutral. Elara, my dear girl. Constance crossed the room quickly, arms outstretched as though to embrace her stepdaughter. Though Alara remained seated and made no move to rise and meet her, Constance's arms fell after a moment, her smile flickering only slightly at the small rebuff before smoothing over again. I have been so terribly worried. A full week, and not a single word from you, beyond the briefest of notes. Anyone would think you had forgotten your own family entirely. I have been well cared for, Lady Whitfield, Alara said evenly. You need not have worried. Well cared for, perhaps, but at what cost to your reputation? Constance turned to the Duke with an expression of practiced sorrow, as though the matter pained her deeply to raise. Your Grace, I do not doubt your generosity in offering my stepdaughter shelter that unfortunate evening, but a week has passed, and I am afraid the length of her stay has begun to invite exactly the sort of speculation that no respectable family can afford to ignore. I have come today to discuss what might be done to resolve the matter properly, for everyone's sake. And what resolution did you have in mind, Lady Whitfield? The Duke asked, his tone perfectly pleasant, giving away nothing of what he already knew of her true intentions. Lord Hale has been most patient throughout this difficult period, but he grows understandably concerned about the delay in settling matters. An announcement of engagement between Alara and Lord Hale, made promptly and publicly, would put an end to any lingering gossip and restore the family's standing entirely. I have taken the liberty of drafting a notice for the papers, in fact, requiring only Alara's signature and yours, Your Grace, as her current guardian for the duration of her stay under this roof, to lend the matter proper credibility. She produced a folded document from her reticule and set it on the small table between them, with the confident air of a woman who had never once doubted the outcome of this conversation. Alara stared at the paper without reaching for it, her jaw tight with the effort of remaining calm. I have not agreed to marry Lord Hale, Lady Whitfield, she said quietly. I was never asked whether I wished to. Alara, please. This is not the time for foolish sentiment. A young woman in your position cannot afford to be particular about such things, not with a family depending on the stability that a good match provides. Constance's voice sharpened slightly beneath its polished surface, the first crack in her carefully composed performance. You have already caused a great deal of talk with this extended stay. Surely you do not wish to make matters worse by refusing a perfectly reasonable arrangement out of some misplaced romantic notion. I do not believe it is misplaced to wish for a marriage entered into freely, Lady Whitfield, rather than one arranged to settle a family's debts. The room went very still. Constance's composed expression faltered, just for a moment, before hardening into something colder. I do not know what you mean by that. I believe you understand precisely what I mean, Alara said, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt beneath her calm exterior. I know about the debts, Lady Whitfield. I know Lord Hale requires my inheritance to satisfy creditors who have grown impatient with his delays, and I know that you have borrowed heavily against my father's estate to fund Beatrice's introduction to society, borrowed more than the estate can safely bear. My marriage to Lord Hale was never intended to secure my happiness. It was intended to solve both of your financial difficulties at once, quietly, before either of you faced the consequences of your own decisions. Constance's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied powder, her hands tightening around her reticule with white-knuckled force. That is a wicked and unfounded accusation, Alara. I do not know where you have heard such lies, but I will not stand here and be insulted by them, particularly not in front of His Grace. They are not lies, Lady Whitfield, the Duke said, speaking for the first time since Constance had begun her appeal, his voice carrying the same cold, controlled authority Alara had heard him use once before, on the front steps of his own house, a week ago now, though it felt like a lifetime. I have made careful inquiries this past week into Lord Hale's financial affairs, and into your own. I have documentation from 3 separate creditors confirming the extent of Lord Hale's debts, and evidence of the loans you have taken against your husband's estate, loans I understand your husband himself has not been informed of, given his current state of health. Constance's composure shattered entirely at this, her face draining of color as she realized how thoroughly her scheme had already unraveled before she had even finished presenting her carefully rehearsed appeal. You have been spying on my family's private affairs? I have been protecting a young woman under my care from being married off to settle debts she did not incur, through a scheme designed to appear, to any outside observer, as a reasonable and loving family arranging a suitable match. The Duke's voice did not rise, but the weight of his words filled the room entirely, leaving no space for Constance's practiced deflections. I would also point out, Lady Whitfield, that Miss Whitfield's inheritance is held in a legal trust, established with clear conditions regarding her consent to marriage. Any attempt to force her into an arrangement without that genuine consent would constitute a serious violation of the trust terms, one that a court would take a very dim view of, particularly given the documented evidence of your financial motives. You would not dare bring such a matter before a court, Constance said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence, wavering now with something closer to panic. Think of the scandal. Think of what it would do to Alara's reputation, to be dragged through public proceedings over her own family's private affairs. I think, Alara said quietly, drawing both their attention back to her, that I have spent long enough worrying about scandal and reputation on behalf of a family that left me standing outside in the cold without a second thought. Lady Whitfield, I do not intend to marry Lord Hale, now or ever. I do not intend to sign the document you have brought today, and I do not intend to return to a household where my welfare has never once been your genuine concern. Constance stared at her stepdaughter with an expression caught between fury and disbelief, clearly unaccustomed to being defied so plainly by a girl she had spent years training to accept quiet mistreatment without complaint. Your father will hear of this, Alara. He will not stand for such disrespect toward the woman who has cared for this family in his absence. My father will hear of the debts you have taken against his estate without his knowledge, Lady Whitfield, Alara replied, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. He will hear of the scheme you devised with Lord Hale to secure my inheritance through a forced marriage. I suspect, once he understands the full truth of what has happened in his absence, his sympathies will not lie where you expect them to. For a long moment, Constance said nothing at all, her carefully constructed composure entirely abandoned, replaced by something raw and unguarded that Alara had never seen from her before, a flicker of genuine fear beneath the practiced performance of concern and authority she had worn for years. Then, just as quickly, the mask returned, colder and harder than before. You will regret this, Alara. Ungrateful girls who turn against their families rarely find the happy endings they imagine for themselves. She gathered her reticule and rose from her chair with as much dignity as she could muster, though the trembling of her hands betrayed the panic beneath her stiff posture. I will not be spoken to in this manner in my own drawing room, nor in anyone else's. Good day, Your Grace. She swept from the room without another word, leaving behind the folded engagement notice, still sitting untouched on the small table where she had placed it with such confidence only minutes before. Alara stared at it for a long moment after the sound of Constance's footsteps had faded, the enormity of what had just happened settling slowly over her. That is done then, she said finally, though her voice did not carry the relief she had expected to feel. That confrontation is done, the Duke corrected gently, moving to sit beside her. But your stepmother is not a woman who accepts defeat gracefully, Miss Whitfield. She will likely attempt some further scheme before this matter is truly resolved, particularly if Lord Hale grows desperate enough to act on his own account. He was proven right sooner than either of them expected. 3 days later, a rumor began circulating through the fashionable corners of society, whispered from drawing room to drawing room, with the particular relish reserved for scandal, involving a reclusive and powerful duke. The rumor claimed that Miss Alara Whitfield had been discovered in a compromising situation with the Duke of Ashbourne, alone and unchaperoned, on the very night of the ball, and that her extended stay at his house since then had been arranged specifically to conceal the consequences of that impropriety. Alara learned of the rumor from Agnes, who arrived in her room one morning with an expression of grim concern, and a copy of a gossip sheet that had somehow found its way into the servants' hall, printed with just enough careful ambiguity to avoid outright libel, while still doing tremendous damage to Alara's reputation among anyone inclined to believe the worst. Who would spread such a thing? Alara asked, though even as she spoke the words, she already suspected the answer. Lord Hale, most likely, miss, or Lady Whitfield herself, working through some intermediary who could not be traced directly back to either of them. Agnes's expression darkened further. It is a cruel and cunning move, if you'll forgive me saying so. A story like this, once it takes hold, is difficult to disprove entirely, and it does damage regardless of how false it may be. Alara found the Duke in his study within the hour, the gossip sheet clutched in her trembling hands, her earlier calm entirely dissolved into something closer to panic. He read the offending passage in silence, his expression darkening with each line, the cold, controlled fury she had witnessed during Constance's visit, returning in full force. They mean to force your hand entirely, he said, once he had finished reading. If society believes your reputation has already been compromised, then a hasty marriage to Lord Hale becomes not merely convenient but necessary, a means of salvaging what little respectability remains to you. They calculate that you will feel you have no choice but to accept his offer, regardless of your earlier refusal. What am I to do? I cannot simply announce to the world that the rumor is false, No one will believe a denial over gossip that flatters their appetite for scandal. No, the Duke agreed. A denial alone will not suffice. But a rumor requires two things to survive, Miss Whitfield: an audience willing to believe it, and no stronger counter-narrative to compete against it. He rose from his desk, his expression settling into something resolute and determined that Alara had come to recognize over the past week as the look he wore when he had settled firmly on a course of action. I intend to provide that counter-narrative myself, publicly, in a manner that leaves no room for further doubt or speculation. What do you mean to do, Your Grace? He crossed the room to stand before her, and for a long moment, he simply looked at her, his sharp eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. I asked you once already, Miss Whitfield, whether you might consider an offer of marriage from me. I am asking you again now, not as a matter of rescuing your reputation from a cruel and cunning scheme, though it would certainly accomplish that as well, but because I have grown to care for you a great deal in the short time I have known you, more than I believed myself capable of caring for anyone after the childhood I endured. I would be honored, Miss Whitfield, if you would agree to become my wife. Alara stared at him, her heart pounding, the fear and anger of the past hour giving way to something else entirely, something warm and unfamiliar and entirely overwhelming. You are certain this is what you wish, Your Grace? Not merely a solution to a scandal, but a genuine choice? I have never been more certain of anything in my life, he said simply. And Alara, standing in the quiet study with the false, cruel rumor still clutched forgotten in her hand, found that her answer came to her without hesitation at all. Then yes, she said, yes, I will marry you. The announcement of their engagement appeared in every paper of consequence within 2 days, and the Duke made certain it was accompanied by no ambiguity whatsoever, a formal statement confirming that Miss Alara Whitfield had accepted his hand in marriage, along with a pointed line noting that she had resided at Ashbourne House under the care of his own trusted housekeeper for the duration of her stay, a detail meant to quietly extinguish any lingering suggestion of impropriety without dignifying the original rumor by addressing it directly. The effect was immediate and, to Alara's considerable relief, entirely in their favor. Society, ever eager to follow whichever story proved most compelling, abandoned the scandalous whispers about a compromised young woman almost overnight in favor of a far more romantic tale, one that grew more elaborate with each retelling. The cold, reclusive Duke of Ashbourne, who had spurned every eligible young woman presented to him for 5 long years, had found a bride not through calculation or arrangement, but through genuine, unexpected affection, discovered on his very own front steps on the night of his own ball. It was, society decided collectively, a remarkably good story, and good stories, Alara had learned quickly, traveled faster and further than cruel ones, provided they were released into the world at the right moment. Lord Hale did not take the news well. Alara heard secondhand, through a note from a sympathetic acquaintance who had witnessed the scene firsthand, that he had appeared at a gentleman's club 3 days after the engagement announcement, in a state of visible agitation, complaining loudly to anyone who would listen about the injustice of losing so promising a match, until a friend had quietly informed him that his creditors had, in fact, already begun proceedings against him, proceedings that no amount of complaining about lost marriage prospects would forestall. Whatever hopes he had built around securing Alara's inheritance collapsed entirely within the week, and with them, apparently, went the last of his standing among the circles that had once welcomed him. Constance, for her part, sent no further letters. Whether from wounded pride or genuine fear of the documented evidence the Duke had gathered against her, she withdrew from Alara's life almost entirely, though word eventually reached Ashbourne House that Alara's father, upon learning the full truth of his wife's financial dealings during his illness, had taken swift and decisive action to reclaim control of the estate's finances, a development that left Constance considerably diminished in both influence and comfort within her own household. Alara felt, when she heard the news, not triumph exactly, but a quiet sense of justice finally settling into place after years of imbalance. Beatrice wrote once more, a shorter letter than any before it, offering something that might have been an apology if read generously, or might simply have been an attempt to secure goodwill now that Alara's fortunes had changed so dramatically. Alara read it twice, uncertain what to make of her stepsister's true intentions, and decided, in the end, to respond with polite but distant courtesy, neither embracing a renewed closeness she did not entirely trust, nor closing the door on it permanently. Some wounds, she was learning, did not require immediate resolution, only patience and time. The wedding itself was arranged for early spring, a modest but elegant affair that the Duke insisted should reflect Alara's own preferences, rather than the grand spectacle society might have expected of a ducal marriage. Agnes oversaw the preparations with the same fierce protective care she had shown Alara since that first cold night, and by the time the appointed day arrived, Ashbourne House had been transformed into something warm and welcoming, in a way Alara suspected it had not been in a very long time, if ever. She stood before the mirror on the morning of her wedding, dressed in pale silver silk rather than the elaborate gowns Constance had always favored for important occasions, and found that she did not recognize, in her own reflection, the frightened young woman who had stood shivering outside these very doors months earlier, waiting for a carriage that would never return. "You look every inch a duchess," Agnes said from the doorway, her eyes suspiciously bright, "though I dare say you were always meant to be one, whatever your family chose to believe of you." Alara turned to embrace her, grateful beyond words for the quiet, steady kindness this woman had shown her from the very first night, when a stranger's household had somehow felt safer and warmer than her own family's ever had. "I could not have arrived at this day without you, Mrs. Doyle. I hope you know that." "Nonsense. You arrived at this day through your own strength, miss. I only kept the tea warm while you found your footing." Agnes patted her hand briskly, blinking back what might have been tears before straightening with renewed briskness. "Now, His Grace is waiting, and I believe there is a ballroom full of guests, eager to see the two of you finally make it official." The ceremony itself passed in a warm blur of vows spoken quietly and sincerely, of the Duke's steady hands holding hers throughout, of a joy so unfamiliar to Alara that she found herself blinking back tears more than once, overwhelmed by the simple, extraordinary fact of being genuinely, unreservedly wanted by someone at last. When the ceremony concluded and the guests moved toward the ballroom for the wedding celebration, the Duke turned to her with a small, private smile that she had come to treasure more than any grand public gesture. "There is one thing I have been considering these past weeks," he said quietly, as they made their way toward the ballroom together. "A small tradition of sorts, that I hoped you might agree to." "What tradition is that, Your Grace?" "Alaric," he corrected gently, as he had been correcting her for weeks now, though old habits of formality died slowly. "I would like our first dance as husband and wife to open in the same ballroom where I first led you inside, on the very spot where the entire room fell silent, wondering what on earth their difficult, reclusive Duke was doing, offering his arm to a stranger found shivering on his front steps." Alara felt her chest tighten with emotion, the memory of that cold, frightening night transformed now into something she would carry with her always, not as a wound but as the beginning of everything good that had followed. "I would like that very much, Alaric." The musicians began to play as they entered the ballroom together, and once again, as it had on that first strange, unforgettable night, the entire room fell silent, every guest turning to watch the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne move to the center of the floor for their opening dance. But this time there was no whispering confusion, no scandalized murmurs about an unknown young woman appearing on the Duke's arm. This time, every eye in the room watched with open warmth and admiration, understanding fully now the remarkable story that had led to this moment. Alara looked up at her husband as they turned slowly beneath the same glittering chandeliers that had witnessed her humiliation and her rescue both, and felt, for the first time in her entire life, that she stood exactly where she belonged. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" she asked softly as they moved together through the familiar steps. "I said a great many things that first night, Alara. You will have to be more specific. You said we might as well give them something worth staring at." She smiled, tilting her head slightly toward the watching crowd, all of them smiling now, genuinely delighted by the romance unfolding before them, rather than scandalized by it. "I believe we have finally succeeded." Alaric's answering smile was warmer than any she had seen from him in their earliest days together, unguarded in a way the cold, feared Duke of Society's whispers had rarely allowed himself to be. "We have, my love, and I intend to keep giving them something worth staring at, for the rest of our lives together, if you will have me." "I already have," Alara reminded him, laughing softly as he drew her closer for the final turn of the dance, the music swelling around them, the golden light of the chandeliers warm overhead, and every trace of that first cold, frightening night finally, completely dissolved into the joy of everything that had followed. Outside, beyond the tall windows of the ballroom, the spring evening had settled into gentle darkness, but inside, surrounded by warmth and light and the steady, unwavering presence of a man who had chosen her freely, without calculation or cruelty, Alara understood at last that she had never truly been abandoned that night at all. She had simply been waiting, without knowing it, for the right door to open, and the right hand to lead her through it. A full year passed before Alara found herself once again standing on the front steps of Ashbourne House, though this time the circumstances could not have been more different. No cold wind cut through her gown, no carriage pulled away leaving her stranded in the dark. Instead, she stood beside her husband in the warm evening light of early summer, watching the first guests arrive for the very ball that, 12 months earlier, had changed the entire course of her life. Alaric had insisted on hosting the ball again this year, on nearly the same date, though he had never fully explained his reasoning until the morning of the event, when she found him in his study reviewing the guest list with unusual care. "I wish to host it again," he admitted, when she asked, "because I did not want the memory of that night to remain only a memory of your suffering. I wanted this house, and this ballroom, to hold a new memory as well, one built entirely on joy, so that when you think of it in years to come, the cold and the fear are not the only things you recall." It was, Elara thought, exactly the kind of quiet, thoughtful gesture that had first shown her the truth of her husband's character beneath his cold reputation, and she found herself deeply moved by it as she dressed for the evening, choosing a gown of deep green silk that Agnes had helped select specifically for the occasion. Much had changed in the years since their wedding. Her father, freed from Constance's financial mismanagement and given proper medical care that the household's restored finances could now easily afford, had regained a measure of his former strength, enough to travel to the city for the wedding celebration held in his honor shortly after the ceremony, and enough, more recently, to visit his daughter and new son-in-law at Ashbourne House on several occasions, always remarking with quiet wonder at how well Elara seemed to be thriving. Constance had eventually left the Whitfield estate entirely, retreating to a small property in the countryside that Elara's father had settled on her as part of a quiet separation, arranged without public scandal. For Elara's father, whatever his faults in failing to notice his wife's schemes sooner, had no wish to drag the family name through further public humiliation once the truth had come fully to light. Elara felt, when she considered her stepmother's diminished circumstances, not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of settled peace, the sense of a long imbalance finally corrected. Beatrice, surprisingly, had proven the most unexpected development of the past year. Freed from her mother's constant pressure and manipulation, she had gradually revealed herself to be a rather different person than the calculating, watchful girl Elara remembered from her youth, someone who had simply never been given the space to become anything other than what her mother demanded of her. The two sisters had begun, slowly and cautiously, to rebuild something resembling a genuine relationship, meeting for tea every few weeks in the city, their conversations growing warmer and more honest with each visit. Beatrice had even become engaged herself, to a quiet, kind gentleman of modest fortune who seemed to value her company far more than her prospects, a match Elara suspected would never have been permitted under Constance's old regime, focused as it always was on securing the most advantageous alliance possible regardless of genuine compatibility. Lord Percival Hale had fared considerably worse. His creditors, no longer willing to extend patience once his hopes of securing Elara's inheritance had collapsed entirely, had forced the sale of most of his remaining property within months of the broken engagement scheme's failure. He had since left the city altogether, retreating to some distant corner of the countryside where his diminished circumstances would draw less attention, and Elara had heard nothing further of him since, a silence she found she did not particularly mind. As the ballroom filled with guests that evening, Elara stood near the same tall windows where she had eaten her first meal at Ashbourne House a year earlier, watching the familiar swirl of silk and candlelight with none of the fear and uncertainty that had gripped her during her first experience of this room. Agnes approached with a warm smile, carrying a small bundle wrapped carefully in soft blankets. "He's grown restless, milady, wanting to see the lights and hear the music, though I dare say he's far too young to understand any of it yet." Agnes passed the bundle carefully into Elara's waiting arms, and Elara looked down at her infant son, barely 2 months old, his small face peaceful and content, despite the noise and bustle of the ballroom beyond. "He shall understand it all eventually," Elara murmured, pressing a gentle kiss to her son's forehead. "This house, this room, everything it has meant to his mother and father both." Alaric appeared at her side moments later, his expression softening the way it always did now when he looked at his wife and son together, a warmth so different from the cold, guarded stillness he had shown the world for so many years, before Elara had come stumbling into his life on a freezing winter night. He rested a gentle hand against the small of her back, his eyes moving between his wife and child with an open tenderness that would have astonished anyone who remembered the feared, reclusive Duke of a year ago. "Our son seems entirely unimpressed by the finest ball of the season," he observed, a faint smile touching his mouth as their infant continued sleeping peacefully, despite the swelling music beginning to fill the room. "He has excellent taste, then, taking after his father in that regard." unbothered by spectacle, difficult to impress. Alara smiled up at her husband, feeling the same warm, settled contentment that had grown steadily between them over the past year, deepening with each passing month rather than fading as she had once feared such feelings might. I seem to recall being quite thoroughly impressed on one particular occasion, Alaric murmured, leaning close enough that only she could hear him over the rising music. A young woman standing alone in the cold, refusing to show fear, even when she had every reason to feel it. I have not stopped being impressed since. The musicians began the opening notes of the first dance, and Agnes stepped forward with practiced ease, to take the sleeping infant from Alara's arms, shooing the couple gently toward the center of the floor with a fond, knowing smile. Go on, the both of you. I'll see to the young master. This dance belongs to you two alone, same as it did last year. Alaric led Alara onto the ballroom floor exactly as he had a year earlier, and once again, the room fell quiet as guests turned to watch, though this time no confusion or scandal colored their curious glances, only genuine warmth and admiration for a couple whose remarkable story had, over the past 12 months, become something of a treasured tale among the city's fashionable circles, retold with growing fondness at every gathering where the subject of true, unexpected love happened to arise. One year, Alara said softly, as they began to move together through the familiar steps, since you found me freezing on your front steps, and decided, for reasons I still do not entirely understand, to lead me inside for this very dance. I understood my reasons perfectly well, even then, Alaric replied, drawing her closer as the music swelled around them. I saw a young woman who had been failed entirely by the people meant to protect her, and I could not bring myself to walk past that failure and pretend I had not noticed it. Everything that followed, I confess, surprised me a great deal more than that first decision did. Surprised you how? I did not expect to fall in love with you, Alara. I offered shelter out of simple decency, nothing more, that first night. I certainly did not anticipate that the frightened young woman on my front steps would, within the span of a single year, become the very center of my entire world, the mother of my son, the person whose company I now find I cannot imagine living without. He paused, his expression growing more serious, more tender than the ballroom crowd watching them could likely see from a distance. I am endlessly grateful, my love, that your family's cruelty brought you to my door that night, even as I remain furious, even now, at everyone who allowed you to suffer so needlessly beforehand. Alara felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though they were tears of happiness rather than the old, familiar grief she had carried for so many years before this house, this man, had become her home. I am grateful too, Alaric. More grateful than I could ever properly express. That cold, terrible night gave me everything I have now, everything I once believed I would never be permitted to have. They danced together beneath the same glittering chandeliers that had witnessed the beginning of their story a year before, surrounded now not by whispered scandal, but by the warm, genuine affection of a household and a society that had come, gradually and completely, to embrace the remarkable love story unfolding before them. Beyond the tall windows, the summer evening had settled into soft, gentle darkness, but inside the ballroom of Ashbourne House, everything remained warm and bright and entirely, unmistakably full of light. And somewhere near the edge of the room, cradled gently in Agnes's steady arms, their son slept on undisturbed, entirely unaware that he had been born into a story that began with abandonment in the cold and ended, as the very best stories always do, with a family finally, completely found.